All right. This is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 23, Section 4, Revolution Spread, Conservatives Respond, 1789 to 1850. So recall at the very conclusion of last section, that is 23-3, we essentially got to the end of the French Revolution in a lot of ways. In some ways, the French Revolution is still going on today. That's when Napoleon, the Emperor of France, who was fighting on behalf of the revolutionary spirit, was captured and defeated finally at the Battle of Waterloo. However, the revolution itself and the ideas associated with it are a significant enough change that even though the immediate cause of the revolution, Napoleon, is defeated, or kind of the immediate catalyst of the revolution is defeated, that these ideas are so powerful in a lot of ways, there is no turning back the clock. In other words, the ideas that the revolution unleashed on the world will never be the same again, essentially. And it spreads to other areas. Haiti is one area in particular that's important. Another one that we'll talk about a little bit next chapter is in Latin America. We'll talk about how the revolution and ideas relating the revolution affect Latin America. But first, let's go to Haiti, because Haiti is rather a unique situation. So here we have a map. We can get a little bit of an idea of where Haiti is. It is located in the Caribbean. It is this particular part. All right, the French called it Saint-Domingue. You got a big, kind of a larger view of what the French Saint-Domingue colony looked like. So we'll just say Saint-Domingue. This is the French French I'll just say French Haiti. That's what it is. That's just what the French called Haiti, right? And Haiti is this island right here, at least this part of the island. Now, Haiti, like many colonies in the Caribbean, especially in the 1700s, was a sugar plantation that relied very heavily on slave labor. And so in 1789, when the Estates General, or the National Assembly, declared that absolute monarchy was over, and then of course, last section in 23.3, we talked all about how the French Revolution unfolded. But when the National Assembly said that the French monarchy was over and then a new constitution and new French government would be created, that had its impact on French Haiti. And you had various groups living in Haiti who looked at the French Revolution for possible gain. On the one hand, you had wealthy planters who really wanted something like freedom of taxation, maybe something similar to what the revolutionaries in America wanted, especially some of those wealthy planters. The wealthy planters were also the slave owners. The gens de couleur were the free black population, and they wanted maybe less racial discrimination. But at the other hand, both of these wanted to keep slavery, because even though for the free blacks living in Haiti, that many of their fellow Africans were enslaved, they still could maintain their position in the social pyramid by preserving the institution of slavery. Some owned slaves themselves. Many of the wealthy planters owned slaves. So they wanted the revolution in part to kind of fulfill their own goals. The slaves, of course, wanted freedom. And so each of these constituencies in Haiti hoped to get something out of the French Revolution with sort of varying degrees of how radical it goes. Initially, the conflict broke out between the wealthy planters and the free black population, essentially amounting to open warfare. In the chaos, slaves rose up against their masters, hoping for emancipation. In other words, it was in some sense chaos. When Francois Toussaint Louverture, a former slave, led Haitian slaves to victory and freedom, not only overcoming the other two classes, which included the wealthy planters and the free black class, which, by the way, one of the things that allowed for the slaves to be successful in Haiti was the fact that these two classes were already at war with one another, and this kind of weakened their position. So Francois Toussaint Louverture, a former slave, led Haitian slaves to victory and freedom over both the wealthy planters and the free black population, but also an attack force by Great Britain. However, in 1794, 5 years after the National Assembly, the National Convention abolished slavery. This was in part due to how successful Toussaint Louverture was. Essentially, the National Convention, which was now the government of France, recognized that there was no way to get the institution of slavery back in Haiti, so it may as well go forward and abolish slavery. However, Napoleon made slavery legal again, right? So made, or maybe legalized slavery, was actually successful in capturing Louverture and assassinating him, but was unable to establish order in Haiti. The former slaves, now the Haitian independence movement, successfully thwarted Napoleon's effort to try and recapture the island. So we might say re-legalized slavery, but failed to reconquer Haiti. Right? And so the reason why Haitian independence is significant, one of the reasons, and this happened in 1804, was that the instance of Haiti was the first instance, and really the only instance, of a slave revolt turned to independent nation, right? It was a slave revolt that led to the creation of a newly independent nation. Meanwhile, back on the European continent, the conservatives, which were ultimately the victorious party in the French Revolutionary Wars, we are talking about Britain, Russia, Austria, Prussia, right? Prussia, which is modern-day Germany, pretty much Germany what we're talking about. They were on the winning sides, and what conservatism really meant in the French Revolutionary period was monarchy, right? So the reigning supreme of kings and queens, nobility, that is bloodlines granting certain privileges, and in most cases the church, right? In most cases the Catholic Church. Prince Clemens von Metternich, he was from Austria, orchestrated what was called the Congress of Vienna, which was a meeting of all these nations, right? So the Congress of Vienna is a meeting of all these nations. And really the question is what to do after the French Revolution, what Metternich of Austria, who's the leader of this, so we might say leader of the Congress of Vienna, we'll go ahead and abbreviate that. What they wanted to do was to restore the nobility and the church, right? To restore. And what they were successful in doing was to reestablish the French monarchy. So the French king was given his throne back. Essentially, the entire purpose behind the Congress of Vienna, in some sense, was to turn back the clock, right? Turn it back to a time period before the French Revolution had happened, before King Louis XVI was beheaded and all the chaos really characterized the European continent, and to protect against future revolution, right? Protects against future revolution. In this case, the countries of Austria, Prussia, and Russia in particular formed the Holy Alliance and were successful in the early 1800s. We might say the Holy Alliance successfully put down revolts, we'll say revolts, in Italy and Spain, amongst other areas, right? So the idea is to kind of keep an eye on the European continent. If there's anywhere where the people are thinking about rising up, overthrowing their king, establishing a democratic government, Austria, Prussia, and Russia in this Holy Alliance agree to essentially put those rebellions down, and they essentially do. So liberal revolutions kind of fail in the aftermath here. However, like I mentioned earlier, in some sense, there was simply no turning back the clock, especially on this issue of nationalism. And nationalism can just simply be defined as kind of like pride in one's nation. Remember, the French Revolution really unleashed nationalism on a scale that's never been seen before. And that was because since the French people reclaimed their government, they cut off the head of the king. They made France an elected government. But, even under Napoleon, who was emperor and dictator, he at least was a popular dictator. He was a dictator chosen by the people. And so nationalism was pride in one's nation. So the people of France really felt invested in their country. They felt like they were a part of it. Again, kind of the distinction to make is that during the French Revolutionary Wars, the French people fought for France. The people in other countries fought for their king, right? So this was a very important idea. Liberalism, for the most part, would mean things like the right to vote in many cases, self-determination, democracy, right? These were all things that, despite the fact of the Congress, the people still wanted this. And the best way to kind of describe Europe in this post-revolutionary era is that the people want a lot of the changes that were brought about by the French Revolution, but the monarchs, the nobles, those that are in power are in an effort to try and diminish it. In some cases, it was successful. For example, in Greece in 1830, a combined force of Russia, France, and Britain helped Greece gain their independence from the Ottoman Empire. So we might say lost Greece. This was, of course, again, a sense of nationalism, which, of course, means Greek people sharing sort of a common identity, common set of cultural values. A lot of times language is a very good indicator of nationalism. People who speak the same language tend to be similar nationality, not all the time. Religion is sometimes a very important part of it, ethnicity, stuff like that. In this case, even though Russia, France, and Britain were generally anti-nationalists and wanted to sort of keep nationalist sentiment down, because Greek independence undermined the Ottoman Empire, they were in support of it. So a lot of the major powers used nationalism to their advantage. Especially in this case here for Russia, which was a rival with the Ottomans. If Greek nationalism could make the Ottoman Empire weaker, then other nations were more likely to support it. In the 1830s, the French king initially threatened to throw out the constitution. He was forced to abdicate the throne, and there was a reassertment of a French constitution. We might say there was the threat to destroy French constitution. Which failed. And again, this would be an effort by the French monarchy to only continue to go down the path of restoring the old order. In Great Britain, there was maybe a little bit less of kind of like violent revolutionary reaction, but you certainly had it there. So, for example, in 1815, when Great Britain passed the Corn Laws, which pretty much prohibited the importation of goods, this would make landowners more wealthy, the Corn Laws did, and made the people pay more for food. Right? The people of Great Britain cried out, and you once again had popular protests. There were voting reforms that took place, which redistributed voting power to the cities. Remember, this is when the Industrial Revolution is occurring. Historically, the voting power was kind of spread out, but a lot of people had moved to the cities since then. And so in order for popular representation to be heard in the British Parliament, there was a requirement that there had to be some sort of redistributing of where the vote was counted, and it was redrawn in a way so that the people got more power, especially in the cities. And of course, this was sparked off by the Corn Laws, which made people pay more for food and would enrich the landowners because they cut off pretty much the importation of food from overseas. Collectively, though, there were a series of revolutions in 1848, Paris, Vienna, Rome, Berlin, all of these calling for the most part for more democracy, more what we might call nationalism. And in a lot of cases, because the Industrial Revolution is underway, worker protections, right? So things like workers' rights, limiting, the workday to a certain number of hours, wage laws, right? And these revolutions were sparked off all across Europe: Paris, Vienna, Rome, Berlin. However, they all had something in common, and that for the most part, they all failed, right? They all failed. The conservatives, in this case, again, we mean monarchy, nobility, and the church, were victorious. But this is a very good representation that these ideas regarding liberalism, regarding nationalism, self-determination, democracy, these ideas aren't going anywhere. And these conservatives in power can only hold on for, as long as they can.